The Vampire of Wingartentrieba by Art Gaines. Chapter 2. The sun arose the next morning to find Sir Allan trudging along on foot through the lower areas of the forested foothills beneath the mountains he had been directed towards. He had already examined the ruins of the old stone house and found it not to be the sort of place that any sort of night creature was likely to make his haunt. But upon approaching the mountains, he had found increasing signs of the presence of night creatures, mostly of the smaller variety like goblins, and judged he was on the right track. He had lightly leashed his horse to a small branch that would hold the animal for a time, but could be easily broken if predators approached or hunger drove it to frustration. It was a horse trained by the best Wranglers Guild of Sutterlarach, and it would remain where he left it far longer than any other breed. With so many night creatures about, it was better to proceed on foot, less likely to be noticed that way. There was no knowing what sort of creatures were in alignment with each other, nor how far the lines of communication might reach amongst them. It would be better to approach the vampire's lair, and Sir Allan had faith that lair was before him, unannounced and unexpected. His horse would have betrayed his presence too easily. It was a proud creature and loud. The tops of the foothills were nearly free of snow, and the grass there was showing signs of new spring life, but between the foothills, patches of ground remained covered in snow. The streams that ran between the foothills had thawed, however, and cut crisp black lines through the pure white drifts. The air had a clean, fresh scent to it that spoke of good living things, of good, clean earth and mulch and last year's leaves. With great, enormous breaths, Sir Allan filled his lungs, finding the air itself almost as rejuvenating as the bread and hardtack that had been his breakfast. Sir Allan did not forget his purpose here, however. There were plentiful signs of fairy folk and night creatures about, and here and there were tracks in the snow left by nearly human feet. Most of these night denizens were probably harmless and too stupid to be any danger to him, but you could never really tell. They were so varied in form and disposition, and most academics despaired of classifying them all. Looking about him carefully, the knight caught sight of a strange large bird staring at him from not too far away. It had something of the look of an owl to it, but also a stork, and also an elderly mage in a robe. Its plumage was an electric blue, fading to a brilliant black around the head. Like all fairy beasts, it betrayed no fear of man in its eyes. It watched him languidly. In fact, as Sir Allan studied it, he perceived a more than beast-like intelligence behind its eyes. Something about the slight flickering of the eyelids and the muscles about its face, more emotive than the face of any natural bird. Its eyes had more the expressiveness of a man's, or at least a dog's. There was something ill-favored about it. Taking a step towards the creature, he addressed it like a man. "The kingdom of heaven is like unto a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds. But when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof." The bird remained passive for a moment, then it scowled in too canny a manner, and rustled itself as if to depart, but before it could take flight, Sir Allan pulled out a one-handed crossbow he had held concealed under his cloak, and shot the fairy creature through the breast. There was a flash of light when the steel tip of the bolt pierced the animal's flesh, as the flesh of all night creatures react to iron and steel. With a sound that resembled "quah," it fell off its perch and plopped ignominiously into the snowdrift beneath it, dead instantly, its heart pierced through and through. Retrieving the still smoking bolt, Sir Allan wiped the black blood from it and returned it to his crossbow, which he then recocked. He was in the habit of carrying the loaded weapon concealed beneath his cloak when traveling through wild parts. The bird had looked like the sort of creature prone to meddling and evil mischief. Years of experience with night creatures and fairy folk had honed Sir Allan's intuitions about these things. Odds were that the moment he passed, the bird would deduce at least some part of his purpose and rush to inform the most important fae it knew in the area, probably the vampire himself, that a Mickeline was prowling around. Sir Allan began to move forward even more carefully as he approached the feet of the mountains, taking even more care to conceal himself and his tracks. Eventually, he came upon what could be described as a veritable goblin road. Goblins do not build roads, of course. They're far too stupid for that. Their intellects are not the sort that can commit to any one project for more than a few hours at a time, but with repeated use, their feet could beat a path down along the easiest route of travel between two well-frequented spots. This was promising. It meant that gobos were congregating somewhere nearby. It might not have anything to do with the vampire, but it was worth checking out. Vampires were not known for having goblin cohorts, but a vampire might conceivably tolerate them if there was no other sort of minions to be had. Goblins will attach themselves to anything bigger and stronger than themselves that manages to bully them enough, even humans on occasion. It would be nothing for any regular vampire to bedazzle a group of goblins with some minor sorcery or enchantment and surround himself with the little gibbering creatures, bowing and scraping to his every whim and offering him every sort of flattery their tiny brains could imagine. Following the goblin road, but keeping off it, Sir Allan eventually came to the mouth of a cave, with a beaten earthen surface before it, upon which sprawled perhaps 24 goblinoids, most of the same basic shape, pot-bellied with spindly arms and legs, though a few were a bit more properly proportioned. Most of them wore those curious visors goblins make themselves out of the rinds of some large round fruit that allow them to see in the daylight. The rest squinted stupidly at their fellows, or kept far back in the deeper reaches of the cave. They were engaged in the foolish games that goblins get up to amongst themselves in times of idleness, most of them cruel and sadistic, involving striking or poking each other with sticks, cackling uproariously whenever the rules allowed them to do so. In other words, it was completely unremarkable, indistinguishable from any other entrance to a goblin kingdom, except for one or two things. First, it might be normal for goblins to post a couple of guards at their front doors and vestibules during the day, but not so many as this, and not cavorting about so openly. Some exceptional influence must have been exerted upon them to behave so strikingly against their nature. Not even the fattest and strongest goblin king could enforce such discipline as this, to force 24 of his people to guard the front gate. As frivolous as their activities seemed to be, they were obviously there for a reason. To guard the caves within as if there was something of actual value inside. Second, quite unusual, a kobold sat among them, wearing a little suit cut in the Christian fashion, tattered, but obviously intended to resemble livery, demarking him as some sort of servant or doorman. He sat upon a little stool next to a little wooden table and stared lazily at the sky. Whenever a goblin got too close, he thwacked at it with a cane. As Sir Allan watched, the kobold took out a little wooden box, transferred a tiny amount of whatever it contained to his wrist, then snorted it up its enormous nose. Some sort of drug, it seemed. Now, goblin kings do not employ kobolds as their gatekeepers. They would normally not be able to tolerate each other's presence for more than a brief time, perhaps at midnight festivals or witches' sabbaths. This meant that the master of this underground place was something much greater than either a goblin or a kobold, something with enough sense of sophistication to employ a night creature butler and bedeck him with livery. A vampire would be so vain. Sir Allan had approached the cave unseen, and concealed himself behind some bushes growing under a thorn tree. He remained there, crouching, watching the mouth of the cave. His breaths were even and steady, and his heart pumped at its regular pace within his chest. If he had merely goblins or kobolds to contend with here, he might have just charged straight in, bellowing like an ox, stomping and punting, and had gobos that got in his way, scattering them like chaff, nearly by the mere splendor of his passing. Normally, if you have to enter some goblin stronghold, for whatever reason might possess you, and the entrance that presents itself is the main gate, the best course of action is to get in and out as quickly as possible, while causing as much confusion as possible, with the intention of being in and out, and long gone, before the gobos have time to collect their wits and rally. This situation called for a great deal more delicacy. He had come not merely to retrieve some trinket, but one of God's beloved children, and the future mother of beautiful, smiling Christian children who would then themselves one day play their part in bringing all things into subjection under Christ's feet, who themselves would one day play a part in crushing the devil's works. But even beyond this consideration, it was always inadvisable to go charging headfirst into a vampire's lair, even during the day, even when the need is urgent. Most vampires have at least a semblance of a man-like intellect, and some may be far more intelligent than a man, and consequently can set traps and employ nasty servants of the sort that can protect them as they sleep. Sometimes vampires do not even sleep at all, but prowl around their haunts listlessly all through the daylit hours, plotting evil or wallowing in the despair into which their insatiable appetites drive them. There could be other creatures within those caves nearly as formidable as the vampire itself, employed as servants or thralls. There might even be more than one vampire. By Sir Allan's estimation, there were still many days left before the girl was entirely enslaved to the vampire, and the true transformation would begin. Every moment he hesitated, the more the vampire's poisons were corrupting her, though. There was some hope that she was resisting him still, but Sir Allan did not think he had ever met a woman with that kind of fortitude, much less one so young. The vampire would be whispering things to her, telling her of the dark powers that would be hers, and the dark delights of the night. He would pick her up and carry her about his abode, locked in his vice-like embrace, showing her his treasures and the dark servants, who bowed and prostrated themselves as he passed. He would set her upon his throne and fill her mind with the dark lust for power. Women's minds were not made to resist such temptations. At least the Mickeline order did not teach so. Eventually, the girl would begin to long for the dark gifts the vampire promised her, and begin to gaze adoringly into his cold, dead eyes. Sir Allan resolved himself to watch until next morning's light, and then take action. He could not wait too long. Whatever information he gathered in the night might very well mean the difference between life and death when he eventually ventured forth into the cave. During the night, he might espy the vampire creeping out of his haunt, or perhaps catch sight of any other of the vampire's more formidable servants, beside the goblins and kobold, of which he was already aware. Bowing his head for a moment, Sir Allan began to pray, silently, in a mixture of Gaelic and French, the two languages of his birth, beseeching the Lord to fortify the girl's spirit as much as was possible until rescue came. In the prayer, he called her his little sister, for that was how he thought of her, peasant though she was, for his vows as a Mickeline referred to all the peoples of Christendom as his mother and sisters, his father and his brothers. It was this penitent posture that saved him from discovery. As he concluded his prayer, he heard a rustling near his feet, and a tiny voice exclaim, "Master." Looking down, he saw a diminutive creature, a goblin imp, craning its head nearly straight up to look at him. The thing was wearing the peculiar slitted goggles that allow such creatures to see during the day but limit their field of view. The imp had blundered upon him, caught sight of his legs, and mistaken him for its vampire lord. Ordinarily, upon tilting its head up to examine the towering human before it, it would have shrieked in alarm upon realizing this was in fact not his vampire master, but a Christian knight. But in his prayers, Sir Allan appeared to be frozen, and the goblin had seen his master freeze many a victim with his hypnotic stare, imprisoning them within their own minds until he was ready to feed. They blinked at each other for a few moments, and the goblin tilted its head back and forth quizzically, trying to make sense of the inexplicable presence of a hypnotized Christian knight crouching behind a bush not far from the entrance to the vampire's kingdom. Too late, realization flashed into the goblin's eyes as it discovered it had misjudged the situation. With a swift motion, Sir Allan swooped down and caught the creature up with his gauntleted hand, squeezing its neck in his vice-like grip. The creature was barely able to make a peep before the inexorable force of Sir Allan's fingers crushed its throat. Holding the thrashing body away from himself, Sir Allan rose a bit to see if any of the other goblins had heard anything of the disturbance. None were looking in his direction, so he was safe for the moment. Feeling a sharp pain, Sir Allan started and nearly dropped the creature he held. The goblin was brandishing a small knife. Allan had not even noticed the creature was armed. Its eyes were bulging nearly out of its skull, and it raised the knife to stab again. With a quick motion, Sir Allan reached around with his other hand, grasped the goblin's arm with which it held the knife, and ripped it clean off its body. The shock proved too much for the goblin, and immediately it fell limp in Sir Allan's hand. Crushing the creature's neck even harder for good measure until he felt bone separate from bone and cartilage mangled beyond all hope of repair, Sir Allan rose carefully to see if he had been spotted again. Once more, he seemed to be safe. Carefully, he removed his gauntlet to examine the wound. Fortunately, the injury turned out to be more of an annoyance than anything that would actually disable him. The knife would barely qualify as a letter opener, more of a stabbing weapon than a cutting one. Stropping a blade being a skill that would tax the intellect of all but the brightest goblinoid. The movement of Sir Alan's hand was barely affected by the injury. His fingers and thumb opened and closed normally without any loss of strength. Goblins sometimes poisoned their knives and spears with their own feces, however, so there was a danger of infection. Sir Alan rinsed the wound with alcohol from a flask, sucked it out as best he could, then rinsed it again. He flexed his hand a few times to ensure the alcohol penetrated as deeply as possible. The pain of the alcohol on his raw flesh barely registered in his mind. His body was covered in scars left by wounds that had been much deeper than this, some nearly fatal. Placing a thumb on the puncture to help it close, Sir Alan turned his eyes back to the cave entrance, searching for any information that might help him in the dangerous feat he was planning to attempt. As he watched, he recited the scriptures to himself in Latin and fell into a sort of watchful meditation. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. Only with thine eyes shalt thou behold and see the reward of the wicked, because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation.